Egypt had one river, and it was kind to them. Mesopotamia had two, and they were not. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not flood on schedule. They flooded late, in the wrong season, after the crops were already in the ground. Some years they barely rose at all. Some years they tore their own channels apart and moved, abandoning cities that had been built on their banks for centuries, leaving them stranded in dust. There was no gentle black soil arriving on time every summer. There was only water that had to be argued with, dug for, dragged into canals by hand, and defended. And out of that difficult, unreliable, dangerous strip of land came almost everything: writing, cities, law codes, the wheel, the 60-minute hour, and the 360-degree circle you still use today. The first empire in human history, the first library, the first named author whose work we can still read. This is the story of Mesopotamia, and it is not the story Egypt told. Egypt survived by enduring. Mesopotamia was conquered, sacked, and occupied over and over again for 3,000 years by Akkadians, Gutians, Elamites, Hittites, Kassites, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Persians, and Greeks. It never had a 3,000-year dynasty. It barely had 3 centuries of peace at a time. And it still won. Because every single one of those conquerors, without exception, ended up adopting its writing, its gods, its mathematics, and its laws. Mesopotamia didn't survive by holding its ground. It survived by being copied. Here is how that happened. Start around 7,000 years ago, in the flat, hot plain in the south, near where the 2 rivers run closest together. There is almost nothing here. No stone worth building with, no timber, no metal ore, just mud, reeds, water, and heat. What the first settlers did have was an idea. If the river won't come to the field on time, dig a channel and bring the field to the river. That sounds simple. It isn't. An irrigation canal has to be planned before anyone benefits from it. It has to be dug by more people than any one family has. It has to be maintained forever, because silt fills it in every single year. And it has to be defended, because the moment your neighbors upstream decide to take more water, your crops die, and theirs don't. So irrigation didn't just produce food, it produced organization. It produced people who told other people where to dig. It produced records of who had contributed and who hadn't. It produced a reason for hundreds of families to live close enough together to argue about water, and a reason for someone to settle those arguments. Irrigation, in other words, produced the city. By around 5,500 years ago, one of them had grown into something the world had never seen. Its name was Uruk. Uruk held somewhere in the range of 40 to 80,000 people inside a defensive wall roughly 9 kilometers long. There is no earlier settlement anywhere on Earth that comes close. For comparison, at this same moment, most of humanity was still living in villages of a few dozen. Walk into Uruk, and you would see things that had never existed before. Streets, neighborhoods of specialists, potters here, weavers there, metalworkers in their own quarter, mass-produced pottery, made in molds, identical, thousands of them, the first standardized manufactured objects in history. And rising above all of it, an enormous mud-brick temple platform, the ancestor of every ziggurat that would follow, dominating a skyline that had no other tall buildings in it, because there had never been tall buildings before. You would also see something less obvious and more important: strangers. For the entire history of our species up to this point, a person spent their whole life among people they knew. In Uruk, for the first time, you could walk down a street and pass 100 people you had never met and would never meet again. Every institution that a city needs, laws, courts, contracts, priesthoods, police, exists because of that one problem. How do you get thousands of strangers to cooperate without trusting each other personally? Uruk is where humanity started answering that question, and we have been working on the answer ever since. And in a back room of an administrative building in that city, someone did something that changed the entire future of the species. They wrote, "Here is the part people always get wrong about the invention of writing. It was not invented to record poetry or prayers or the deeds of kings. Those came later, centuries later. Writing was invented by accountants. The earliest tablets from Uruk are inventories: barley, sheep, jars of oil, quantities of textiles, who delivered what, and how much is owed. A temple economy feeding tens of thousands of people needed to track resources at a scale that human memory simply could not hold. So a scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and made a mark that meant a fixed number of a fixed thing. It is the least romantic origin imaginable for the most important invention in human history, and it is almost certainly true. Those marks evolved. Pictures of things became abstract wedge-shaped signs, what we now call cuneiform. Signs stopped standing only for objects and started standing for sounds, which meant they could record spoken language, which meant they could record anything. Names, contracts, complaints, love, grief, laws. Clay, unlike papyrus, does not rot. It bakes hard in fire, so the very act of a city burning down preserved its records instead of destroying them. This is why we know more about the daily life of an ordinary Mesopotamian than about almost any other ancient people. We have their receipts, we have school exercises with a teacher's corrections, we have a letter from a man complaining about the quality of copper he was sold, which is nearly 4,000 years old and reads exactly like a modern customer complaint. For a few centuries, this world was made of city-states: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur, each with its own patron god, its own ruler, its own walls, and its own long-running feud with the city next door over water rights and border fields. They fought constantly. We have the treaties. We have the boundary stones. We have the propaganda, carved reliefs of one city's soldiers marching in formation over the bodies of another city's dead, which is the oldest surviving depiction of an organized army in the world. And it was in this world of squabbling city-states that a man appeared who decided that all of it should belong to one person. His name was Sargon, and by his own account he was nobody. The story he told about himself, written down and copied for over 1,000 years afterwards, was that his mother had set him adrift on the river in a basket sealed with pitch, that a gardener pulled him out and raised him, and that he rose from cupbearer to king. Whether any of that is true is impossible to say. That he wanted people to believe, it tells you plenty about him. Around 4,300 years ago, Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian city-states one after another, and then kept going, north up the rivers, east into the mountains, west toward the Mediterranean. What he built was the first empire in human history. Not a kingdom, not a dominant city, an empire. Multiple peoples, multiple languages, and multiple regions, ruled from a single center by an administration that answered to one man. He installed his own governors in conquered cities. He standardized weights and measures. He kept a standing army, and he boasted in an inscription that 5,400 men ate before him daily. He also did something quietly radical. He appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god at Ur, and she wrote hymns. Her name is on them. She is the first author in recorded human history whose name we know, and she was a woman, writing in Sumerian more than 4,000 years ago. Her poetry was still being copied by student scribes 500 years after her death. The Akkadian Empire lasted roughly 180 years. Then it collapsed. The reason should sound familiar. Around 4,200 years ago, the climate across the entire region shifted hard toward drought. This is the same event, the same decades, that broke Egypt's old kingdom and ended the Pyramid Age. In Mesopotamia, the rains failed in the north, the northern farms were abandoned, and refugees flooded south into a region that could not feed them. Two of the most sophisticated societies on Earth, on two different rivers, fell apart at the same time for the same reason, and neither one knew the other was going through it. The empire fragmented. Mountain peoples from the east, the Gutians, moved into the vacuum, and Sumerian scribes wrote about them with the pure contempt of a literate civilization, describing people it considered barbarians. But the cities themselves survived, and about a century later, the city of Ur pulled the south back together. This period, the Third Dynasty of Ur, produced two things worth knowing. The first is the great ziggurat of Ur, a colossal stepped mud brick platform whose lowest tier still stands in southern Iraq today, 4,000 years later. The second is bureaucracy, genuine, obsessive, industrial-scale bureaucracy. We have recovered well over 100,000 administrative tablets from this one period. Every sheep, every laborer's ration, every jar of oil, logged, sealed, and archived. If you have ever suspected that paperwork is one of the oldest forces in civilization, the Third Dynasty of Ur is your evidence. It lasted about a century. Then, weakened by famine and by pressure from the west, Ur was overrun by the Elamites from the east. They sacked the city and dragged its last king away in chains. Sumerian scribes wrote a lament for the destruction of Ur, so raw that reading it now, 4,000 years later, is still uncomfortable. The goddess of the city, they wrote, sat outside her own ruined temple and wept, and would not leave. Sumerian as a spoken language faded out around this time. It survived for another 1,500 years, the way Latin survived in medieval Europe, as the prestige language of scholarship and religion, learned in schools by people who spoke something else at home. The something else was Akkadian, and the new center of power was a city that had been unremarkable for centuries: Babylon. Around 3,800 years ago, its sixth king inherited a small, weak kingdom surrounded by larger rivals. He spent nearly 30 years being patient, building canals and walls, signing alliances, and breaking them when it suited him. Then, in the last decade of his life, he moved and conquered nearly all of Mesopotamia. His name was Hammurabi, and he is remembered less for the conquering than for what he had carved on a 2-meter-tall block of black stone. The Code of Hammurabi is not the world's first law code. There were earlier ones, and we have them, but it is the most complete, and it is the one that survived intact, and it is astonishing to read. 282 laws, covering wages, divorce, inheritance, medical malpractice, construction standards, theft, adultery, debt, and slavery. If a builder builds a house badly and it collapses and kills the owner, the builder is put to death. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his own eye is put out. That principle, an eye for an eye, is right there in the stone, and it echoes forward into legal traditions that are still argued about today. What makes it remarkable is not the punishments, which are brutal, and which scale openly by social class in ways no modern person would defend. What makes it remarkable is the ambition. Here is a ruler saying publicly, in a monument anyone could walk up to, that there are fixed rules, that they apply beyond the king's mood on a given day, and that a person can know in advance what will happen to them. That is the beginning of an idea that took another 3,500 years to properly grow up. Hammurabi's empire did not outlive him by much. His son lost most of it. And about a century and a half after his death, an army came down from Anatolia, hundreds of kilometers away, sacked Babylon, and then simply went home again, apparently having come mostly for the loot. These were the Hittites, and it is one of the strangest raids in ancient history. Into the wreckage came the Kassites, who ruled Babylon for over 4 centuries. They were foreigners, they spoke a different language, and they became, in almost every way that mattered, Babylonian. They worshipped Babylonian gods, wrote in Akkadian, maintained the temples, and copied the old literature carefully enough that we owe them much of what survives. This is the pattern. Watch for it from here on, because it repeats every single time. Meanwhile, in the north, along the upper Tigris, a different kind of state was growing, and it would become the most feared military power the ancient Near East had ever produced. Assyria. The Assyrians were not the first Mesopotamians to make war. They were the first to industrialize it, a professional standing army rather than seasonal levies. Iron weapons at scale, siege engines, battering rams, and engineers who could take walled cities instead of starving them out. Cavalry, a road system with relay stations, so orders and reinforcements moved faster than any enemy could react. And deliberate, advertised terror. Assyrian kings had their campaigns carved onto palace walls in enormous detail, cities burning, prisoners impaled, heads stacked in piles, populations marched into exile. This was not shame, it was policy. The reliefs were shown to foreign envoys on purpose. Surrender, and you pay tribute. Resist, and this happens to your city, and everyone will see it. They pioneered one more tool that outlasted all the others: mass deportation, conquer a rebellious region, and instead of killing everyone, uproot entire populations and resettle them hundreds of kilometers away, mixed among strangers, far from anything they might fight to defend. It was brutally effective. It permanently scrambled the ethnic map of the entire Near East, and it is the reason several peoples in the historical record simply stop appearing. At its height, roughly 2,700 years ago, the Neo-Assyrian Empire controlled Mesopotamia, Syria, the Levant, much of Anatolia, and for a period even Egypt itself. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, and here is the contradiction that makes Assyria so interesting. This same state produced one of the great intellectual projects of the ancient world. Ashurbanipal, its last great king, was literate, which was unusual for a monarch, and he was obsessive about it. He sent agents across his entire empire with instructions to find, buy, borrow, or seize tablets and bring them to his capital at Nineveh. He was assembling a library, systematically, with the explicit goal of collecting all knowledge. It worked. Tens of thousands of tablets catalogued and organized, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, omens, dictionaries, and literature, including the most complete surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a poem about a king who cannot accept that his friend has died and who goes to the end of the world looking for a way not to die himself, and fails, and comes home, and understands that the city he built is the only immortality he gets. That poem is over 4,000 years old. It survives because a violent empire's book-collecting king put a copy in his library, and because when that library burned, the fire baked the clay instead of consuming it. It also contains a flood story. A god warns one man to build a boat, load it with his family and animals, and ride out a deluge sent to wipe out humanity. When the waters recede, he releases birds to find land. Anyone raised on the story of Noah recognizes the shape of this immediately, and the Mesopotamian version is the older one by a considerable margin. When the first translation was read aloud in London in 1872, it caused a genuine public sensation, because it meant that a story people had assumed was unique had been circulating in the Near East for well over 1,000 years before the Bible was written down. Because it did burn. Within about 20 years of Ashurbanipal's death, the empire that had terrified the entire region for 3 centuries came apart with astonishing speed. Overextended, exhausted by constant rebellion, and worn down by decades of civil war over the succession, Assyria was attacked simultaneously by the Babylonians from the south and the Medes from the east. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, It was burned so thoroughly and the region emptied so completely that when Greek soldiers marched past the site 200 years later, they had no idea what the enormous ruined mounds beside the road had been. The most powerful city on earth had become an anonymous hill in under 2 centuries. Babylon inherited the empire and had one final spectacular flowering. Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt the city into something ancient visitors struggled to describe without sounding like they were exaggerating. Massive double walls. The Ishtar Gate, faced with deep blue glazed brick and covered in relief animals in gold and white, part of which stands reconstructed in a Berlin museum today and still stops people in their tracks. Temples, palaces, and a processional way running through the middle of it all. And, according to later Greek writers, terraced gardens irrigated somehow at height, which have never been definitively located and may never have existed. Babylonian astronomers in this period were doing serious mathematical work, recording planetary positions systematically over centuries, and building predictive models accurate enough that Greek astronomers later borrowed their data outright. The reason there are 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle is that these people counted in base 60, and nobody has ever quite managed to stop. Nebuchadnezzar also, in the course of putting down a rebellion, destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and deported a large part of the population of Judah to Babylon, an event that reshaped an entire religious tradition, and that is why Babylon appears in the Hebrew Bible as the archetype of the great, arrogant, doomed city. It was doomed, but not dramatically. In 539 BCE, less than 30 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, the Persian king Cyrus the Great arrived. Babylon, by most accounts, opened its gates. There was no long siege and no destruction. Cyrus walked in, presented himself as the legitimate restorer of the city's proper gods, and Mesopotamia became a province of the Persian Empire. 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great took it from the Persians, was crowned in Babylon, planned to make it a capital of his enormous new empire, and died there at 32 in a palace beside the Euphrates. After that, the ending is quiet, which somehow makes it worse. Alexander's successors built a rival Greek city upriver and moved the administration there. Babylon's population drained away over generations. The canals that had kept the whole system alive for 4,000 years silted up faster than a shrinking population could clear them, and salt, the slow poison of all irrigated agriculture, accumulated in the soil until the southern fields would no longer grow wheat. The temples kept going for a while. A small community of astronomer priests carried on observing the sky and recording it in cuneiform, in a language nobody spoke, in a script almost nobody could read, for centuries after the world had moved on around them. The last known cuneiform tablet is an astronomical almanac dated to somewhere around 75 CE. Think about what that means. The civilization that invented writing produced, as the very last thing ever written in its script, a table predicting where the planets would be. Not a prayer, not a lament, a calculation about the future made by people whose own future had already ended. And then the script went silent for 1,800 years, and nobody on Earth could read it until European scholars cracked it again in the 1800s, and an entire lost world came back. So did Mesopotamia fall? Its cities are mounds in the desert, its languages are dead, its gods have no worshippers. Every empire on that list, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, was destroyed, usually violently, usually by someone from the mountains or the desert who wanted what the plain had. But you tell time in their base 60. You measure a circle in their 360 degrees. You live in cities, which they invented, under written laws, which they invented, recorded in writing, which they invented. The oldest story you can still read is theirs, and it is about a man learning to accept that he is going to die. Egypt survived by lasting. Mesopotamia was conquered again and again and again, and it won anyway because it turned out that ideas are harder to sack than cities. But there is one more river civilization from this era, older than Babylon, larger in area than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, with planned cities, standardized bricks, covered drains, and a writing system of its own. We have thousands of examples of that writing. We have never been able to read a single word of it, and we still do not know for certain what happened to the people who wrote it. That's next.